Hello and welcome to A Closer Look, a long-running web series from Asia Society Switzerland, in which we cover issues, countries and topics that are making headlines and deserve a closer look. In this video, we're talking trade with Hosuk Lee-Makiyama in Brussels and Deborah Elms in Singapore.
Where we've lost the plot is we've sort of imagined that trade only affects, rich people or people who own stocks. And we've forgotten that trade actually matters to everyone in everyday life.
For years, for most of us, news on trade hit out in the pages of the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times. Not anymore. Headlines and hot takes on trade and tariffs fly around everywhere as the world's two largest economies, US and China, are escalating their trade war. Longtime US allies in Europe, as well as its neighbors in North America, are an equal target of the Trump White House. The rules-based system of global trade that had been in place for 3 decades looks to be evaporating as we speak.
If you have a country that says, sorry, there is not enough benefits, and therefore we're not going to follow the rules, you face a system collapse. And this is basically what's been happening now.
Again, take all of your previously held assumptions and throw them away and start over again.
So what does this all mean? How can companies, consumers and governments in Europe and Asia best respond to make sense of what is happening for as much as that's possible as the situation changes at an unpredictable pace and in unpredictable ways? I asked Hosuk and Deborah how things are looking from where they are.
If you're in Europe, I think we are coming to an end of a remarkable period where European businesses could build and sell its product all around the world almost without any restrictions. We are at the apex of European privilege. And this period is never ever likely to come back if it slips.
That's Hosuk Lee-Makiyama, the director of the European Center for International Political Economy in Brussels. You'll hear a lot more from him in a little bit. But first, let's go to my conversation with Deborah Elms in Singapore. Deborah is the head of trade policy at the Hindrich Foundation, a Singapore-based organization that works to advance mutually beneficial and sustainable global trade. And before that, Deborah was the executive director and founder of the Asian Trade Center, also based in Singapore. Deborah, thank you very much for joining us. Things are changing very quickly when we talk about trade, tariffs, introductions, trade policies. How do you keep track of it all and how do you keep a clear head, if you do at all?
Well, I thought I knew what to expect after the first Trump administration, in which I used to call these Donald days. And I thought I was ready for more Donald days in my future. But this one is actually turning out to be much more of a tsunami. How do you keep track of it all? Well, now one innovation from then until now is WhatsApp chats, on which I'm on several. And so the volume of information is crazy. When you wake up in Asia, there's 157 messages waiting, and they're all like things you have to pay attention to. And did you read this? And have you seen that? So that helps structure a little bit because these are, very smart people who've been paying attention while I was asleep. And then, reading the news always is part of my job, but it's become really, really a part of mine, and trying to, spend a bit of time, although this is the hard part now, thinking about what does that mean? What's changed really since yesterday? What is this piece of news that's coming in so fast? Does it materially change the outcomes, or is it just a possibility? If it's a possibility, is it a real possibility? Like we might actually see something change in the next hour or 24 hours, or is this like 2 months from now, something might change? And so trying to sort out that has been difficult.
I listened to a conversation you had a few weeks ago on the Copy Time podcast produced by DBS Bank in Singapore. And I thought it was interesting. You said anyone who's pro-open trade has done a terrible job explaining how free trade benefits average people, be they Americans, Europeans, Indonesians. And you said we've forgotten why trade matters to us. Made me wonder why has it been so difficult to explain these benefits and how would you improve on that?
I don't know why it's so difficult. For me, it's sort of, again, it's what I do for a living, but for me, it's very simple. Just look around you and almost everything that you can see, that you eat, that you touch, that you breathe, that you're watching, that you're listening to, most of that is actually traded. Most of it has at least some element, some component that involves a foreign country, a foreign firm, a foreign provider. And if it didn't, then you might have fewer options available to you, or you might have higher costs. And so I think where we've lost the plot is we've sort of imagined that trade only affects, rich people or people who own stocks. And we've forgotten that trade actually matters to everyone in everyday life. And if we can't make that message clear, then it's very hard for people to understand why all of this high-sounding, discussion actually makes a difference in their lives.
Not too long ago, you wrote, we've been also focused on Trump's tariffs, that it's easy to forget. There's a whole agenda, this American First Trade agenda, coming to radically upend global trade and have implications for governments, businesses, and citizens all around the world. First, just looking at the tariffs, we now are seeing an additional 10% tariff on Chinese imports to the U.S. Beijing retaliated by imposing a 10 to 15% tariff on certain U.S. goods, including some energy products. So what's the impact on global trade flows of tariffs like these?
That's a great question. I think part of the challenge we're having is that the consequences are harder to see. So it sounds like 10% tariffs. That sounds manageable, right? Okay, so costs are 10% more. But remember, it's on top of existing tariffs, which are often 25, sometimes higher. So we're looking at really 35% tariffs coming in on products from China. Plus, they changed the rules, which is, again, a sort of wrinkle that you may not have paid attention to. But if you were an American business or an American consumer buying e-commerce goods from China, you're now paying not just 35% higher often, but sometimes even higher than that, because now you have to pay the original tariff plus the 25% plus the 10%. And in fact, it's worse than that, because on top of all the tariff costs are new compliance costs. So all of a sudden, what's a fairly cheap product coming in from China or Hong Kong is now a very expensive product coming in to your mailbox. And so I think these kinds of changes are important for individuals, but they also signal to the larger community, global community, that it's possible to engage in trade practices that we would have considered unthinkable just a short time ago. So I think it's not just what the U.S. is doing today to China, but potentially what will happen as other countries maybe pick up part of this agenda for themselves, or as we sort of slowly unravel those ties that have bound us together for decades.
And what are the other things in this America First trade agenda? The joint tariffs have you worried, and how will it upend global trade?
There's a couple of things in there that sound kind of benign, because it sounded like a memo that was just asking agencies to think through stuff and give us a report on April 1st. But actually, all of it's pretty radical, because, for example, the very first important sentence says that there is a trade imbalance in goods and that it needs to be addressed. So just that sentence makes you say, wait a second, that means that we're only talking about trading goods, not services, not investment, not intellectual property flows, whatever else, trading goods. And that there's an imbalance, which is a Trumpian thing, but it was not a problem for anyone pre-Trump. And that it has to be tackled, which means you have to do all kinds of previously unthinkable things in order to tackle that imbalance, which is apparently a problem. So just that very first sentence, when you really sort of unpack it, you say, wow, this is radical, and it's quite different. The global trading system is not built on trade in goods balances or imbalances. The global trading system is built on allowing trade as much as possible to flow across borders with the minimum amount of restrictions. And if we're going to undo that and unwind that, potentially, then lots of things go. So if we're going to, for example, ignore the World Trade Organization rules on goods, what happens to the World Trade Organization rules on services? Are we going to follow those? Are we going to change those rules? Are we going to change rules on intellectual property rights? Are we going to change the way in which we coordinate with one another? Are we going to be changing standards? And product standards are often the thing that firms complain most about. Those are largely as much as possible in alignment in some areas, but they don't have to be. And so, if that's now on the table, trade becomes much more difficult for all of us, and not just for Americans and not just for trade with the United States. And the consequences of this destruction along the way, it's hard to predict. But, every day you get a bit more alarmed about the direction, because the more damage you cause, the harder it is to sort of heal back up again.
About the WTO, it was built to provide predictability in trade, including a place to hash out disagreements. That hasn't worked for quite some time now. Dispute settlement is dysfunctional. We see countries just putting in unilateral measures like tariffs, export controls, security-driven restrictions on trade. What is the role of the WTO in 2025? if not much anymore, what is replacing it?
Well, those are some great questions. I don't know who's thinking about the answer to these questions, really. Like genuinely saying, what happens if a system that requires all of us to agree on a basic set of norms and principles erodes? What happens if we return to the law of the jungle, in which the largest players have the biggest power and they do whatever they want and the rest of us don't? Do we say that's the end of the system and we all just go it alone? Do we say, okay, the big players go do their own thing and the rest of us cooperate? Do we break into blocks of some kind?
Mm-hmm.
Do we say like-minded coalitions of the willing in certain areas cooperate? I don't think we know yet where we're going to head. In part, I really still think it's a lack of imagination, frankly, by folks who are steeped in trade, who are struggling to think about a world that is so fundamentally different. You know, if law doesn't matter and if power is becoming the most important currency, then the traditional ways of managing things don't work anymore. So then what, right? I think it's that difficulty that individuals are having in getting to the so then what answers. You know, I have to say, I mean, the WTO, I say this often, I love the WTO, obviously I've worked on this a long time, I care about trade. In the lifetime of my children, it hasn't done anything. You know, and my children are not young. So then I think like, wow, if that's where we're at, like we already had a problem, which is to me what makes Trump so dangerous. It's not just that Trump is dangerous on his own. It's that he's up against a very weak system. And the collision of Trump plus weak system is really creating challenges that we just haven't seen and we haven't dealt with. And so our ability to think about alternatives, I think, is not where it needs to be.
The Commerce Minister of Thailand was very optimistic about the return of Trump, expecting the increased trade tensions between the US and China to benefit his country and others in Southeast Asia. What's the impact of this new era of unpredictability on middle powers like the ASEAN countries, but also perhaps Japan, South Korea? We'll talk about Europe in a little bit if that's all right.
I think from my perspective, a lot of Asia has been too relaxed about the return of Trump. Because from their perspective, they won in Trump 1. They got a lot of inbound investment, both foreign investment that had been in China that moved out and Chinese investment from China moving out, all of which was about diversifying their own risk. They figured that Trump 2 would be the same, right? They would be able to balance between the two, that they could serve both sides evenly. It would be great. And I think that is potentially naive, which is, although you hear again and again and again, especially from leaders in this region, don't make us choose. Don't make us choose. We want to pick both sides. We're good friends with both. We have to be, etc. I think it's going to be very hard to not pick sides. And you see this pointy part of the spear, as the Americans would say, over and over again in very short order. So you saw it in who's supplying chips to whom, who is relabeling packages for what, who is eligible for certain preferences and who isn't. I think it's going to be harder to find those pockets of opportunity this time around than a lot of people across this region, Asia region, are really prepared to admit. And I think, as another example, if you look at over the weekend when we had both Canada and Mexico in the firing line, a lot of the complaints from firms that were based in Mexico were actually coming from Japanese and Korean companies who had relocated production into Mexico and had been, for decades actually doing business in Mexico for North American purposes. And it was their complaints that were the most vocal about changes that would be happening to arrangements between North America. And I think that's going to get replicated elsewhere. So a lot of firms from everywhere, again, Korea, Japan, China, Europe, US, all have investments across Asia, many of which is meant to service the American market, the European market, the Chinese market. And suddenly they're exposed in ways that, again, you didn't have to think about before. You could simply trade. And now you have to think about what exposures do I face to what kinds of risks, what's actually in my supply chain. Even if you're a small business, you don't think of your having a supply chain, but you do. Where are your raw materials, your parts, your components, your final products going? How are you going to get it there? I mean, all of these questions are back top of mind.
Maybe one of the ways in which countries in Asia and elsewhere are creative are by already in the past years building some big regional trade deals that are already in force, a lot of them between countries around the Pacific Rim, excluding the US, between Asian and European countries. Again, all without involvement of the US. This so-called noodle bowl of bilateral regional trade deals, can it be enough to fill the gap or compensate for a loss in trade with the US for countries that are involved in those trade deals?
I think it's going to become an increasing option. I think firms are going to start to say, okay, yeah, the US market, very lucrative, has been very lucrative for us for a very long period of time. We've built products and services to deliver to that market. We know it well. We have all the relationships. We love it. That's why we're still there. But actually, it's getting much more complicated and much more expensive and much more risky. And so maybe at a certain point, firms will say either early or when they get hammered, either one, that's when we shift and we then look for alternative markets. And those alternative markets could be anywhere. They could be across Asia. As you mentioned, we have lots of trade agreements. So I'm not suggesting, just to be clear, that trade as a whole will stop. We're still going to have trade. But I think it's definitely being reshuffled in ways that are new, that are developing patterns that we hadn't anticipated. And I suspect, although again, it's early days, 2 weeks in, I suspect that more firms will decide to cut the U.S. out of their own supply chain footprint than might have originally been anticipated, because they will say, okay, we make less money if we sell someplace else. Ultimately, for us, it's worth it because the risk is just much lower. And I think from the U.S. perspective, or at least from Trump's perspective, maybe that's fine. Well, now we've got America first. Nobody's trading with us. Fantastic. But I do think it leads to lower growth overall in the United States, and it leads to problems in the rest of the economies in Asia that have been built for so long around access to the U.S. So I think you're disrupting this trade. It might be fine in the near term, short-ish, medium term. But like right away, there could be some really painful adjustments that take place.
Over the past couple of years, especially since the start of the war in Ukraine, but also now with trade and Trump, Europe seems to have been a bit in like sitting in the corner and just trying to see what's coming at us and hope for the best. I was wondering, though, if we just focus on trade here, and is there a role for Europe and its consumer market of still 400 million people to shape trade rules in this new fragmented system that maybe doesn't involve the US as much as it used to?
I would say, yeah, there's definitely an opportunity, but this is going to be very controversial in Europe. I'm saying it anyways. I've been in Asia almost 20 years now. You can't do it the traditional way that the Europeans have tried to drive trade, which is that there is a certain rule book. That's our rule book, and you all have to live up to that rule book or forget it. That, I think, is problematic. And I think if Europe could show a bit more flexibility, absolutely, there is plenty of scope. You can see that from Europe's ambitious agenda that they have on trade agreements in general, and especially here in Asia. I think that's been applauded and should help cushion the blow of trade readjustment. But it does also require some creativity and new thinking on the part of Europe, which is, what are we going to do if the United States is off doing whatever it wants to do? And if the Chinese are doing, I don't know what, do we cooperate? Do we not? It's unclear. How can we create a trade and economic landscape that works for us with or without the U.S.? And then, hopefully, of course, the U.S. comes back and is part of the global economy. That'd be lovely. But in the meantime, at least it solves some of our challenges and allows our trade to continue and jobs and economic growth to continue. Because one aspect that nobody's talked about, just raise it while we're here, is what happens to economic development in the, lesser developed countries. We have certain models of how that's supposed to happen, and trade is a big part of that. And if we're closing down trade lanes, if we're making trade more difficult, if we're making it more expensive, if we're going for country-specific product standards, if we are increasing the compliance and paperwork costs, if we're asking for new climate rules to be imposed on developing economies, then we've closed off an avenue for growth and jobs in the developing world. And we don't have a platform for a lot of developing countries to express that if the WTO is a bit stuck. Where do they go? How do they manage this? This is going to be a huge challenge going forward, in my view.
If the US proves to be an unpredictable partner and rules don't really matter anymore, China has its own economic issues at the moment, but could it come out of this for the better? And
one of my WhatsApp chats has been like, if I was China, this is what I would be doing. And I would be saying, look, compared to that crazy tariff man over there, like, we look calm and rational. Please, do this, that. We're happy to work with you on the following cooperative outcomes. I think that's possible. Again, like, take all of your previously held assumptions and throw them away and start over again. I think there are, again, opportunities that we didn't explore in the past. Whether we can seize those opportunities, I don't know, because it's going to depend on, what the U.S. does, what China does, what everyone else does in the meantime, what companies do, because remember that trade is not actually about what governments want, it's about what companies do. And companies do not have identical views with their government. So there are a lot of firms identified as American who are not fond of what's happening right now. And they will have to figure out some way in which to navigate a really unpredictable world with an unpredictable president and still manage to make money to pay for their employees and their shareholders and all of that.
Consumers, no matter where they are, do they have agency in a trade war?
I think you saw an interesting demonstration of this when the tariffs were under discussion with Canada. And I don't think that discussion is finished. We're going to have that resurface, I suspect, regularly. But there was a lot of consumers and businesses in Canada that almost immediately switched their buying from U.S. products to Canadian products. I think, yes, there is agency by consumers. Now, that's, of course, incredibly disruptive, and consumers don't always know what it means to be Canadian and American in terms of the companies. But there is some agency there by individual purchasing or not that might suddenly get exercised, again, in ways that we didn't anticipate. So I would say look to what happened with Canada and whether this gets sustained. Because, again, over the weekend, we suddenly had people, jettisoning a lot of American products, buying Canadian products. Do they keep that up? Do they do it for a month? Do they do it for a year? Do they never do it at all? I don't know. But I think it shows how quickly you can actually mobilize consumers sometimes, particularly if they feel like their national pride and sovereignty is at stake.
I want to go back to where we started and refer to your conversation on that podcast, Copy Time, out of Singapore. And you said about what happened, but this was, 2 or 3 weeks ago? So that's a lifetime in trade policy.
These days, yes.
The way we're seeing right now. You said it's going to be very bad. I'm extremely alarmed by the direction of travel, and we're heading for a whirring cycle of bad things. Is that still your view?
Yes. Yeah. Well, at the moment, I thought I had imagined like bad scenarios pre the beginning of Trump's actual term in office. But there are things that they're doing that I've just never... Again, the number of things where you just say, I never thought I would see the day when fill in the blank what. Because it's just like literally hour by hour. And some of those are really beyond what I expected. So if you say, are we going to have one other thing? Again, it hits a bit hard for me because I'm American, despite having been in Asia for 20 years. So I say, well, is the United States going to be able to come back from this? I just think about what's happening with the civil service. And once you start to lose that expertise and you're not bringing it in at the bottom levels, like that is a generational problem. Now it's going to take a long time to build the U.S. back again, even if it suddenly switched tomorrow, literally tomorrow, to being something different. Yes, I'm more alarmed than I was because I just think about how challenging it is to build those norms of consensus and behavior that we've had that help structure the world that we live in. And it's just sort of being tipped over overnight. And how do we build it back up again? It took us decades to get to here. I don't want it to take decades to get to the new, whatever the new normal is, where we feel stable and relatively certain about what's going to happen. But I'm worried that between now and then, it's just going to be really chaotic, risky, and uncertain. That is it's unsettling personally to individuals. It's unsettling to firms who are trying to figure out, do I hire this person? Do I not hire this person? It's unsettling to countries. Do I send people here or there? It leads to a reaction where you either shut down altogether, like I'm not going to do anything, or you lose your mind. I worry about where we're headed here. But again, I'm also in the middle of this. if I had the luxury of being able to say, I'm not going to worry about all that other stuff, I'm just going to do my day job and I'm going to go teach yoga and be done, maybe I would be in a different space.
All right. Yeah. Deborah Elms, thank you so much for your insight. It was very, very, very valuable.
Thank you very much.
And for the second conversation, we're moving from Asia to Europe, from Singapore to Brussels specifically, where we find Hosuk Lee-Makiyama. Hosuk is the director of the European Center for International Political Economy. He's also a fellow at the London School of Economics and a leading expert on trade diplomacy, EU Far East relations, and the digital economy. Hosuk, welcome.
Thank you.
For decades, the last 3 decades at least, it seems the system of global trade served the goal of shipping stuff around the world with ever-growing efficiency, making it ever cheaper to get stuff all around the world. That era kind of seems to be over. Trade policies like unilateral tariffs as doled out by the US are not about making global trade more efficient anymore. They're used as a geopolitical tool. Just basically, what's good about tariffs as a tool and what is despicable about them?
Well, the basic theory is that tariffs are highly inefficient tools for policy objectives, meaning that whether the purpose is to protect your domestic industry and help them to prosperity, or if it's about raising fiscal revenue, it's a highly regressive and ineffective tool that creates economic rent. It's rarely about what's most efficient. This is a very much an economist view. If you look at from the perspective of, let's say, a least developing country, you don't have the means to tax your own domestic population. It's not just the fact that it's highly unpopular. You may not even have the tools to actually tax them. So you may have a huge gray economy. The only thing that you control is the borders. Sometimes it is the only policy option you have in terms of fiscal tools. Yeah, and as tariffs as a national security tool, I don't think it's so much about the instrumentation. Tariffs are fairly straightforward, easy, especially if you don't care about multilateral rules. And if you don't care about table manners, even easier.
I saw you on Al Jazeera a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, where you argued that we're now going back to ordinary times with the introduction of tariffs coming from the US. And you described the past 30 years of global free trade agreements and supply chains were kind of the exception. And I think the word you used was it was an extraordinary privileged time in which East and West could trade with each other without wars, without rivalry, colonialism. And you concluded with, in a sense, we're now returning to normal with this trade war that has now been ignited. Although, I mean, you could say it started already 7-8 years ago. I was wondering, is that good, going back to, as you call it, normal?
Look, I'm a Cold War kid, right? So I was born in the very early 70s. And so I was born into a period of, well, Carter and actually even Nixon, but the whole era of ideological conflict. The division between East and West was very much a norm, let's say, since 1945. And you could very well argue it was a norm before that, because before you had the continental powers against the Allies. So in a sense, I mean, historically, we had periods of globalization, but what we can clearly see, I think, is that we had one of the key preconditions for free trade, which is peace and no systemic rivalry, which was very much the case, let's say, from the fall of the Berlin Wall until the emergence of, well, not just China, but also one could argue that the true point of diversion was when Russia left G8. You can argue about the exact point of time, but the globalization is indeed a anomaly, but also the conditions for free trade has not always been the case. And one example that I can really bring out is the fact that the GATT system, the precursor of the World Trade Organization, which we always think of as the backbone of multilateralism, the universal international trade rules were not that universal. The period that we had just before the WTO was created covered about 40% of global trade, which is more or less what TPP would have had in terms of global coverage of trade if the United States had stayed in the agreement. Or you could say it's a sum of US and EU trade. So it was always a highly selective club based on non-rivalry and conforming with a certain understanding and preconditions for free trade, if you like.
Does that mean the WTO, being an organization, as you described it, not having been built to deal with rivalries, was it then always predestined to be doomed? If we're now back in this period of normalcy where we do see rivalry, we do see trade tensions?
I don't think necessarily, I don't want to talk in terms of doomed, although I think very much now the World Trade Organization as an institution is very rapidly heading there, especially under the current leadership. But if you look at the structure of its rules and its architecture, and also where all the bodies are buried in the drafting of the agreement, it, first of all, is not designed to address state capitalism of a sizable scale like China, but the rules were designed in the 90s basically to address the newly liberalized market in Eastern Europe, to make sure that Europe actually stayed on the course of free market liberalization, opening up to investment, which, of course, Eastern Europe was very much interested in doing. So it addressed a completely different target to begin with.
Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, said in Davos, it is in no one's interest to break the bonds in the global economy. She was referencing both the US and China and cautioned against, as she called it, a race to the bottom on global trade, especially after the news of the tariffs Trump imposed on China and perhaps more to come. Kind of does feel that we're in that race to the bottom von der Leyen was mentioning, or am I just too pessimistic?
Well, it's not in Europe's interest. And in the case of the United States, it's abundantly clear that the current economic equilibrium does not work for the United States in terms of its fiscal commitments, not just domestically, but around the world, its trade deficits, and also the lack of opportunities for average working man. I mean, regardless you're a Republican and Democrat, I think you would very much agree that basically the current economic structure of the United States have become untenable. And it's a very common reaction for receding power. And if you look at the tariff in that perspective, it's very much about forcing your counterparts to the table to renegotiate that equilibrium. And this is the same with the WTO. If the organization doesn't work for you and you have not the means to actually reform it, you basically threaten to leave. And you build a whole new thing.
We're seeing more regional trading blocks, but also that trend towards countries moving on, it seems, on trade without the US. I believe I read of the 10 fastest growing trade corridors in the world, only 2 involve the US, 6 out of those 10 involve China. Is the world just moving on from America and finding other ways to trade without the Americans, or is that even possible?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, obviously, the United States underwrites the system. Why were people following the WTO rules, or why was there any compliance with any rules whatsoever? Well, because the Americans were underwriting and bringing benefits for other countries than itself. The second United States said that, sorry, this doesn't actually work for us anymore. You have to find someone else to step in and bring those benefits on the table. Otherwise, you will have, as we've seen now in recent months, everyone from Indonesia to, well, anyone, including the United States, actually, saying that we will not conform with the rulings of the WTO panels. The rule-based systems is always based on a voluntary compliance between sovereigns. And if you have a country that says, sorry, there is not enough benefits, and therefore we're not going to follow the rules, you basically, you face a system collapse. And this is basically what's been happening now.
Europe seems to be in a bit of a bind. It's under pressure to align with the US as its longtime ally. Europe is also depends on China. That in a time where you can wonder what it even still means to be an ally of the US. Well, what options do you see for Europe? And you clearly don't agree with that, or?
No, actually, I agree fully. The only thing I may have a little bit nuanced view of is whether Europe and United States we are strategic allies, but I think we see now that NATO is by no means an ironclad partnership like the one, let's say, between Japan and United States. Why? Because let's face it, the main theater of the world where the future is actually staked out is not around the Atlantic. Ukraine is a very regional conflict. Europe is a very regional power, and Europe's influence around the world is comprehensive. But in terms of borders, people, suffering, Europe is a regional power at best. So I think the utility of Europe for the United States is not so much of a strategic partner, perhaps, but something of even a double-edged sword. It's true that China is a very important and perhaps very dangerous adversary, but Europe is far more influential against the US interest in terms as a commercial rival. And Europe represents a completely different, not necessarily ideological, but at least a regulatory perspective that is in direct competition with the model that United States is advocating around the world. And that's across digital trade, agriculture, and what have you.
Regional powers like that, like Europe, but also the countries in ASEAN or Japan, do you think they together could drive new trade rules now that the system that had been working so far seems to not work any longer?
That's very difficult to say. And I mean, you would even first and foremost ask yourself, what is the demand, or who is the demander for rules and that predictability? It's not necessarily business. Who is the demander for institutions? And clearly in the case of the WTO, it's not the United States, it's not China. Both have found ways to circumvent it, and both have realized that actually there's a whole new set of rules now. What I think we are seeing now is that there are countries, not just United States, but also China, and to a certain degree also other G7 countries, who are looking to change the current order to make their own economies more balanced.
Trade, the headlines will keep coming. More tariffs on the EU, and retaliation tariffs towards America. It'll dominate the headlines for the foreseeable future. So what is an average consumer of that information, of news like myself, to do to kind of interpret the impact of these things on trade and on how much I'll pay for my stuff in the store online, as opposed to, well, don't panic too much?
It depends probably on where you are. I mean, I think it's abundantly clear that the voters in the United States are expecting a major change in how their economy is organized. And to be perfectly frank, I think they're looking at something that probably looks more like Europe, a healthy trade balance. They want to see goods made, whether it's cars or something else. So we can talk about that, but basically jobs, creating exports, they're creating a slight surplus. They want to see major corporations succeed that brings healthy development in equity prices, as well as some payback in form of increased median real wages. And that's not an unreasonable thing to have. The question is how you do it and at whose expense you do it. And here's where I think that a lot of countries around the world have suddenly woken up and realized that the major power benevolent, the one that signed the check, might abruptly stop doing so. And the cost of having allies is not something that make a cost-benefit analysis for someone like the Trump administration. This is why I think we see Canada and Mexico and Europe in the crosshair, whereas China is something of a sideshow currently. And if you're in Europe, I think we are coming to an end of a remarkable period where European businesses could build and sell its product all around the world almost without any restrictions. We were defended for free by Americans so that we could actually spend that money on building hospitals and schools and a wonderful social welfare and transferring system. Russian gas kept us warm over the winters for bargain prices, and you could trade with both China and Sub-Sahara as well as United States. And the rule-based order was very much created in the mirror of Europe, as we were talking before. And this period of the apex period of Europe, if you like, is never ever likely to come back if it slips. And here's where I think I'm very quick to criticize the European or the German psyche in this regard, but I completely understand our desire to retain the status quo, because it could never get better than this. It's as simple as that. But the strategy to retain status quo is perhaps the most expensive strategy of them all. And here's where I come back to the WTO, for example, or our trade agreements. If we want to keep exporting, if we want to keep our factories, utilization rate in our factories high, that comes at a cost. We have to create benefits for others. And that's not something that we are used to. That's not something that we are not used to paying for other people's benefits. And this is where we always stick to the rules and the system like lawyers. This is an approach that works for Europe very well. And obviously, this doesn't work for emerging economies of Asia. It's impossible to take sides. And I absolutely understand the ASEAN situation in this. And I think overall, what you see is there is a rivalry between China and United States. And especially as China wants to see its own rebalancing in terms of its own influence. Ultimately, everyone in Asia have taken sides. Every consumer knows, or every voter knows, which side of the pack they belong. The main concern in this power rivalry here is that United States and China can actually perfectly live in a world of G2, where they're basically co-convening or co-governing the global order. And that's perfectly fine as they are concerned. But as China emerges, how we treat them on their ascent is also how they're going to treat the weaker powers once they're in power. And here's where everything we do in terms of export controls and everything we've done in terms of various trade measures is exactly how China is going to treat new emerging powers. And one thing that is actually quite striking is that a part of China's sanction policy is to never hit back. We avoid to the furthest extent possible to hitting back at stronger powers. They only go after weaker. So you can clearly see that they go after Germany. They can go after India, but they never go against the 5 members of the Security Council. They have never ever retaliated against the UK, and they have been extremely cautious about going after France. But they are happy to go after Germany. They are go after Japan. So we are reshaping the order in a direction where we decide how we deal with stronger or weaker power balance in the future. And we may not like what the outcome will be. I think not everyone really sees what's at stake. Ultimately, Europe always take the right decision, but not before we have walked into a disaster. But once we are in the disaster and it's a fait accompli, we always dig our way out by doing the extraordinary that no one expects. That's the greatness of Europe.
That's strangely optimistic, quick turnaround from disaster to very optimistic and digging your way out. Let's hope you're right. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Hosuk Lee-Makiyama speaking to us from Brussels about the turbulent times in global trade that don't seem to be ending anytime soon. That's all for this edition of A Closer Look. Find all previous episodes of this series on our website, asiasociety.org/Switzerland, or scan the QR code. Thanks very much for watching.